Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Managing Configuration Manager Clients lesson in the System Center 2012 Configuration Manager Training course. This lesson is chock full of good stuff. We're going to start by talking about the client properties that are available once you have a client installed. Basically, once you've installed the System Center Configuration Manager client to an endpoint, what kind of properties are available in the Configuration Manager console. Next, we'll talk about some tasks that can be initiated from the server console to manage those clients. From there, we'll talk about how you can monitor client health and how you can then block and unblock clients if you have a need to do so. Next up, managing user device affinity, quickly followed by managing conflicting client records. After that, we'll move on to exploring some local client options, things you can do actually on the client itself once the Configuration Manager client is deployed. And we're going to wrap this lesson up with a look at a third-party tool called Right-Click Tools. In my opinion, it's one of the absolute best add-ins that's available for Configuration Manager. In this lesson, you're going to learn about some of the direct management benefits that come once the Configuration Manager client's been deployed. You'll also learn to see whether or not a client agent is healthy, and you'll learn how to initiate specific actions from a client itself. Specifically, you'll learn how to initiate a policy refresh cycle, which will update the policy on the client more quickly than would otherwise happen. From a business goals perspective, once you have the client installed, you can improve overall efficiency by centrally managing client computers. No longer do you have to go out to individual computers physically and work on them. You can do so from the centralized Configuration Manager console. Once you have clients deployed, you can actually see a whole bunch of properties about that client from within the System Center Configuration Manager console. Every client that you add to the console carries with it a whole lot of properties. These properties can be used to create new queries, form collections, and much more. So let's say you've got a whole bunch of Windows Server 2008 machines out there. Well, you can create a collection based around just Windows Server 2008 computers. As an action item, we're now going to peruse the properties of one of the GlobalMantics clients that we've just recently added to the hierarchy. As you can see, we're now in the Configuration Manager console, and I'll select a client at random, right-click it, and choose Properties. And here's those properties that I was talking about, and these will become useful later on when we start looking at ways to create collections. But you can see there's a whole lot of properties going on here. There's the SID of the machine, Configuration Manager unique identifier, the system container name that is included in an Active Directory, a user account control value for machines that support user account control, whether or not it's blocked, which we'll be discussing later in this lesson, its approval state in the hierarchy, which it is approved so that it can join and make use of hierarchy resources. The Active Directory site is joined to the way that it was discovered. It used system discovery to be located and then added to the Configuration Manager hierarchy. So as you can see, there's actually a lot of different pieces of information here that you can use later on if you like. And the other tabs up here, deployments, are if you've started installing software to the resource, you're going to see those deployments here. And you can actually use custom variables, but those aren't anything that we're going to be really focused on here. Before we go, let me just show you client activity detail. And I know we've looked at this before, we'll look at it again, but this is a way you can see what kind of activity is taking place on the client. When did it last request this new policy? When was its last heartbeat discovery? When was the last time it did a hardware scan? And you can get all of those details right from here in the Configuration Manager console. And you'll see that there's other pieces of information here, including the client check detail, which we'll see in a minute. And the result should be that it was successful. If we have endpoint protection enabled, which we don't yet, you'll see information about that here. And with endpoint protection enabled, we'll get details about any malware that may be installed on the machine. One of the primary reasons that many organizations deploy a tool such as Configuration Manager is because it provides centralized administration of the endpoint environment, including desktops and laptops. Well, when you install the Configuration Manager client to a Windows-based endpoint, you end up with a number of capabilities that you don't generally have without a tool like Configuration Manager, including centralized ways to look at the different hardware configurations that are out there in the environment, which is the purpose of Resource Explorer. Remote control of the endpoint, which you can still do to a certain extent using third-party tools, but not in a centralized way. Remote assistance, which when available enables IT to respond to users who initiate remote assistance requests in a centralized way. And the remote desktop client, which is available on all Windows Professional and basically Enterprise class editions. However, it's not centrally administered in most cases. Generally, remote desktop is enabled on a Windows 7 client, and then from wherever an administrator happens to be, he or she has to remember the name or the IP address of each individual client and then connect to it. With Configuration Manager, having to remember all of that information goes away because it's all available from right within the Configuration Manager console. I'd like to briefly show you at least Resource Explorer so you can see where these client tasks are initiated from in the console. As you can see, we're in the Configuration Manager console, and I've gone to the All Systems collection. If I right-click Win7-1, you're going to see that I have a number of items here that I can use. For example, Start is the one I'm most interested in right now. And this brings up those 4 items that we just saw. If I do Remote Desktop Client, it'll initiate a remote connection. Or I can do remote control or request that I can do remote assistance if a user would like me to. Resource Explorer is actually kind of neat. This gives you a look at all of the hardware that's associated with the client. So you can see exactly what the hardware configuration is for that particular client. For example, the operating system. We can see that it's Windows 7 Enterprise Service Pack 1. We can see how much physical memory it has. Now notice that has 2 RAM slots, one with 512 megs and one with 256. While this is a virtual machine, that just happens to be how it's interpreted when it comes back over to Configuration Manager. And if you want proof that it's a virtual machine, there you go. It's running on VMware. We then have some Configuration Manager client SSL information. All kinds of information from a hardware perspective about that client. Right now, we don't see a whole lot in the way of software, but we will later. Now, the neat part about the hardware configuration is you can actually have a hardware history. So, if a user decides they're going to go out and do something on their own from a hardware perspective, you can actually determine when that change took place. Also, notice what I just selected, System Console User. On that day and time, the username Scott logged in locally, but at that time, this was the machine's name. Here, that's when the administrator user logged in from the domain. And here's how much time that user has spent on the console. You get some significant information about what's going on in your hierarchy by being able to use the Resource Explorer. Now, we looked at some of this previously as well, but once you have Configuration Manager's client deployed, you can start looking at some client health statistics. And client health, as you may remember, is monitored in the monitoring area of the console and on the client properties page. Now, just as a refresher, because this is a relatively important topic, we're going to go back over to the Configuration Manager console for Global Mantics and take a look at client health. Now that some time has passed since the client has been deployed, we should see that most, if not all, clients are now in a healthy state rather than that sort of in-between state that we may have seen earlier. And we're back, and this time we're in the monitoring area, and I've selected client status because this is where we're going to get information about clients and their health status in the hierarchy. First of all, we have a couple of tools, client activity and client check. Client activity will give us information about the activity status of clients, and we'll do that in a minute. But we also have client check, which is going to view information about the health of our clients. And you can see right on this page, we get a number of pieces of information. We get active clients that have passed client check or no results. Basically, all 5 clients that we have deployed have passed client check. And if we go here, we can see the same information, but with a pretty graph. This time we can see that everything's green. This is a good thing. And if we look at client checks trends, basically we'll see that all of our clients have went from 0% to 100% over a short period of time, because before we didn't have any clients. And now we have 5 healthy clients. The client check is passed. If you want to see which clients have actually passed their check, just click and it'll bring you to a list of clients that have passed their check. There you go. Go back to monitoring. And this time we'll go to client activity. We have 5 active clients. And so this is a good thing. Basically, 5 clients are doing things, which is a good thing. That means they're checking in. That means they're getting policy refreshes, all kinds of good stuff. And again, if we click, we're going to get to see all active clients this time that are available in the Configuration Manager hierarchy. And this is where we want to go next. And we've seen this before, and I won't be doing it again. So this will be a third time, but we're going to look at the client activity detail. And again, this is where we get some more additional information about exactly what's taking place on the client. There comes a time when you may need to block a Configuration Manager client from being able to communicate with the Configuration Manager hierarchy. For example, suppose a client has been lost or stolen. In that case, you may not want the client to be able to access the hierarchy, because whoever has access to that client then may have access to information that they really shouldn't have. However, simple blocking, which is a capability that's built into the Configuration Manager product, is not always effective when using just HTTP communication, as a client can easily rejoin the site with a new self-signed certificate and a new hardware ID. Now, your average attacker, if they're looking at attacking the Configuration Manager hierarchy, may not know that. So a lot of times blocking can be effective, but it won't be a only line of defense that needs to be put into place. There's another way that you can go about blocking clients from being able to communicate with the Configuration Manager hierarchy. The second way is to revoke the client's certificate. This is the most effective method for blocking a client from using the Configuration Manager hierarchy. We're going to cover this topic in the Firewalls and Security lesson in this course. Blocking is considered a second level of defense, but it's also more immediate. Once you block a client, it's immediately stopped from communicating with the hierarchy. Certificate revocation can take a little bit of time to take effect. So you may want to do both if you have to block a client from communicating with the hierarchy. Before we continue, I'm going to show you how to block a client, not the certificate revocation method here, but I'm going to show you how to block a client in the console. So let's go over and learn how to block a device. As you can see, we're here in the Configuration Manager console, and I've gone to the Assets and Compliance area, and I'm in All Systems, so I can see basically everything that's deployed. Well, let's say Win7.2 has been stolen. Some thief came in and just stole it. That's bad. Well, we can right-click Win7-2, and very quickly we can block it from being able to communicate with the hierarchy. Notice you get a warning. It also tells you that some other things are going to be affected. If we block it and it has out-of-band management capability, it's going to revoke its AMT PKI certificate. AMT is an Intel technology. If you do this, and then the device is reprovisioned, or basically unblocked, it can't be managed out-of-band again until the provision state in the BIOS is reset so that it can check back in with the Configuration Manager hierarchy, basically. What this does is it basically re-adds it as a new device to the Configuration Manager hierarchy for all intents and purposes, and tells it this client can now be managed out-of-band again. We're not going to be doing a lot in the way of out-of-band management in this course, so it doesn't really matter if this actually takes place, because Global Mantis does not have Intel AMT-based systems at this point. We click OK. And then if we go to the properties of this machine, we should go to the bottom and see that it is actually blocked. Now you may wonder, how do I unblock this machine? Well, guess what? Right-click it and choose Unblock. And you'll get the same warning, well, a similar warning to the one we saw before. And click OK. And again, if we right-click this machine and go to Properties, this time we should see that it is now set to false as far as blocked goes. Not too tough, eh? One of the features of Configuration Manager 2012 is the ability to link a user and a device together in a very deep way. And this is called user-device affinity. And Configuration Manager supports deploying content to devices based on the identity of the primary user of that device. Now, user device affinity can be managed manually or automatically. And I'm going to demonstrate the manual process here for you in just a second, but as you might imagine, the manual process is probably only good for smaller environments. If you have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of clients, there are probably not a lot of Configuration Manager administrators out there that really want to go through and have to manually apply a user to a device or a device to a user for every single device or user that's out there. But that said, there may come a time when you do want to be able to manually make this affinity choice, and so we're going to show you how to do that right now. This time, I'm still again in the Assets and Compliance area, but instead of opening up a device group, I'm looking at a user collection basically. And you can see we do have some discovered users from the Active Directory environment. And the reason for that is simple. If I go to Administration and Discovery Methods, you're going to notice that I've enabled Active Directory User Discovery. And if I look at the properties for that, you'll notice that I told it to start at the root of the Active Directory domain, recursively search folders, and include groups. That's why it's able to find users to be added to the Configuration Manager hierarchy into collections that can be used later on. Well, I want to show you that you can create a device affinity using either a user that's been discovered or a device that's been discovered. So let's take global /Scott. Basically, that would be me, my account. If I right-click that item, I can choose Edit Primary Devices. This brings up, strangely enough, a screen called Edit Primary Devices. Now, I want to search all devices for a device that I can assign to this user. I'll type win. And as if by magic, two devices with the word win in them come up. Isn't technology incredible? And I can select one of those devices, or both if I like, and click Add. And what this does is it creates an association in Configuration Manager between this user and this device. Now, the same thing can be accomplished by right-clicking a device and choosing Edit Primary Users. This time, I can tell it that I want the administrator user to be able to be assigned to the device. And you're going to see that we now have a primary user of administrator within an affinity type of user defined, which is a nice way of saying manual. And that's how you create device affinities in Configuration Manager. Now, the power of this whole thing comes later on when you start deploying software, as software can follow a user based on their device associations. For those of you that would rather spend your time doing something a little bit more productive than assigning clients and devices to one another, there's an automated affinity creation process that's available as well. And this is in a client setting that's named User and Device Affinity. Basically, what Configuration Manager does is it watches for patterns in the usage of an endpoint or how a user is using a device. And then after a specified number of minutes and days, a user and a device are automatically linked to one another in the Configuration Manager hierarchy. And I'm going to show you how to configure automatic user device affinity right now, as I think this will help solidify this concept a little bit and give you a better understanding for exactly how this automatic creation process works. Automatic device affinity is done as a client setting in the environment. So we're going to go to the administration area and go to client settings. And let's look at the default client settings and take a look for this. You'll notice the last setting is user and device affinity. And we have something set up here that basically says user device affinity after a threshold. After a certain number of minutes, a device becomes assigned to a user. Or days, after users use a device for 30 or more days, it becomes assigned to that user. Except it's not, because right now it's set to false as far as automatically configure user device affinity from usage data. If we set that to true, we can also then adjust these numbers depending on how we want to configure our environment. And then eventually, over time, users and their devices will become associated with one another. Remember, a user can have multiple devices associated with it. So, after these thresholds are met, one of these thresholds is met, then the users and device affinity will be created. You can also choose whether or not to allow users to set their own primary devices. This is disabled by default, and we're going to leave it disabled. That can create some issues in the environment. As you may imagine, users may try to just assign themselves to a whole bunch of different machines and it can create some level of chaos in the environment if you're not careful. For now, I'm just going to cancel these changes because Global Mantics is going to remain with a manual affinity creation method because it's small. There's a simple fact of life that every configuration manager administrator needs to keep in mind, and this is the fact that you'll probably end up getting conflicting client records from time to time. This is basically when you have a duplicate hardware ID or a duplicate record get entered into the configuration manager database for the same piece of hardware. Perhaps the machine was reinstalled, or perhaps it was removed from the hierarchy at one point and then re-added. For whatever reason, you end up with duplicate records from time to time. Configuration Manager will attempt to automatically resolve the conflict. It'll use Windows authentication of the computer account or the PKI certificate in an attempt to identify which record is the right one. You can also manually resolve conflicts by going to Monitoring System Status Conflicting Records. Now, the automatic conflict resolution you can actually turn on or off in the Configuration Manager hierarchy, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But we're also going to go over to the Configuration Manager console for Global Mantics right now, and I'll show you where you need to go to manually resolve a conflict. I don't have any conflicting records, but it's easy to show you where to go in order to be able to resolve a conflict if one should take place. I've already gone to monitoring. This is where we're going to go to start looking at this whole conflicting records thing. And we'll go to System Status, and you'll notice we have conflicting records. Right now, there are no conflicting records, but if you do have conflicting records, this is where you go to attempt to resolve them. And as I mentioned, you can also configure Configuration Manager to automatically resolve conflicts using a hierarchy setting called Client Approval and Conflicting Records. So, as you may guess, we're going to go over to the Configuration Manager console for Global Mantics and configure the hierarchy to automatically resolve conflicts if it's not already configured in this way. To make sure the hierarchy can automatically resolve conflicting records, you go to the Administration area, Site Configuration, and then right-click Sites and choose Hierarchy Settings. One of the tabs you'll see is called Client Approval and Conflicting Records. And in the bottom box, you'll see that we have something called Conflicting Client Records. And what's going to happen is you'll see that it's automatically set ready to automatically resolve conflicting records. So the hierarchy comes pre-configured to attempt automatic client conflict resolution. And this is a good thing because it's just an administrative hassle that you really don't need to worry about. Basically, if Configuration Manager detects duplicate hardware IDs, you can tell it, resolve the conflict. And basically, it's going to try a couple of different methods to resolve the conflict. One is logging into machines. The second is basically using the PKI certificates in order to attempt to determine which client is actually valid. Or you can tell it you would prefer to manually resolve conflicting records if you would like, and then just by selecting this checkbox. Now, we've really focused on the server side of the Configuration Manager client equation, but there are some things you can do locally as well. You can actually initiate certain actions from the client, and I'll show you all of the actions you can initiate in just a minute, but the one that's most interesting is forcing a policy update. And what this does is it tells the Configuration Manager client, okay, something's changed in the hierarchy. I want you to go out and I want you to get a new set of policies and apply them immediately. What you'll find is this will greatly aid you in your troubleshooting efforts. And the reason is this, because if you make a policy change, there's a client setting that tells the client how often it should go check in for its policy. It might be an hour, it might be even just 30 minutes. But when you're troubleshooting, you don't want to wait 30 minutes for that policy refresh to take place. Instead, you can go force the client to do a policy refresh immediately, get its new settings, and greatly streamline your troubleshooting efforts. There are also local agents that are installed as a part of the Configuration Manager client installation. Every distinct function that takes place on the client has a local client agent associated with it, and I'll show you those in a couple of minutes. From the local client, you can actually manage your site information as well. You can assign yourself to a different site if you really wanted to, and you can also manage network information. Now, we're going to go over to one of the two Windows 7 machines that we have installed the client to, and we're going to take a look at some of these local client options and how you would go about using them. And this time we're on a client. And I'm going to go to Start, Control Panel, and you're going to see we have a Configuration Manager item right here. And when I select it, it brings up a Configuration Manager window. I'm going to get rid of this, so clearing things up a little. And here you can see the General tab, we have some general client properties, including the assigned management place where it's going to be going, the management point, I should say, which is SCCM 2012. It has a self-signed client certificate. It's always going to be connected via the internet. The site code is GM1. And here's its unique identifier in the Configuration Manager hierarchy. And here's the client version. The client version becomes important when you start having to do client updates, although Configuration Manager 2012 has also taken significant pain out of the client update process because it allows automatic client updates when a new version is detected. If you're wondering how a new version can be detected, when you apply a service pack or a patch to Configuration Manager, it will sometimes include an updated version of the client. Here are the components that make up the client itself, and these are those agents that I was talking about. You're going to see we have a policy agent. This is what's responsible for getting configuration policy from the Configuration Manager hierarchy. We have an out-of-band management agent and a hardware inventory agent responsible for gathering hardware information from the client. And we have a whole bunch of different agents that are installed. And you can see that there's some that are disabled, some are enabled. Remote Tools is disabled right now. Then we have some actions. This is where you can initiate, for example, a policy refresh. There we go. A machine policy retrieval and evaluation cycle. Notice we have machine and user policy, and they are separate. If you're looking for machine policy, you can then just click Run Now, and it will go and tell the Configuration Manager system, give me some new stuff. And you can do the same thing for the user policy. You'll notice that there's also application deployment evaluation. Are there new apps to deploy? Discovery data collection. Is there new discovery information that you want to get? You can collect file information from a client. You can basically tell it, initiate that process so you can update Configuration Manager with my file inventory, or my hardware inventory, or my software inventory. If you're using software metering, you can also enable that cycle to be run whenever you like. And as you can see, there are a number of these different kinds of actions. Here's the site to which this Configuration Manager client belongs, and if you wanted to change that for whatever reason, you can click Configure Settings, and then look for a new site. Remember, we only have one site for Global Mantics. This is the cache file that we have locally. And remember, this cache file is used when software is downloaded from the hierarchy. And again, if you wanted to click Configure Settings, you can see some information such as the location of the cache, and notice right now that it's 5 gigs. If you wanted, you could change the location of the cache to, for example, a different drive, or you can change the size of the cache here. Right now, we don't have any configuration baselines. We're talking about those elsewhere in this course. And we have network settings, which again, there's really nothing here to change because we're on the local network and it knows exactly how to communicate with the hierarchy. And that's basically what there is to local client information. Believe it or not, the Configuration Manager console is actually just a little bit limited in what you can accomplish from a client management perspective. However, some very enterprising folks out there have created a tool called the SCCM right-click tools. I've used these tools in my own production environment, and they are absolutely incredible. They provide a much streamlined set of capabilities and a much broader set of capabilities to a centralized administrative console, the Configuration Manager console, than would otherwise be there. For example, if you look at the screenshot here, there's a number of things that you can do from the console using right-click tools that's not generally and broadly available easily from within the Configuration Manager console out of the box. For example, a hardware inventory cycle from the client. You can actually initiate some of these client-based activities from the console using right-click tools. I can't install right-click tools into my Configuration Manager environment right now, and the simple reason is this. We're attempting to show you how to use Configuration Manager out of the box. Right now, right-click tools add some capabilities that aren't otherwise there. But at the end of this course, the first thing that I'm going to do is install right-click tools because it's a fantastic set of tools. And you're going to see the link for this in just a minute, and where you can download it and install it in your own environment if you like to use it. In fact, there's your link. We kicked this lesson off with a discussion about client properties and how you can review them on a system that's being managed by Configuration Manager. Next, we discussed server-based Configuration Manager client tasks, such as various ways that you can connect to your clients remotely. And then we reviewed the ways you can monitor client health from within the System Center Configuration Manager console. And then we briefly discussed blocking and unblocking clients, a topic we'll revisit in the security lesson in this course. We then learned how to manage user device affinity and how to manage conflicting client records in the System Center Configuration Manager hierarchy. Then we took things a little bit more local, and we started looking at some local client options that are available from within the client that's been installed to the various machines in the environment. And we kept it local, but this time centralized, by showing you a great add-in called Right-Click Tools that really enhances the life of any System Center Configuration Manager administrator. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.